Lieutenant Colonel Harold Royce counted the men he had left before he counted the ridge in front of him. It was 8 o'clock in the morning on August 17th, 1950. The heat was already climbing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The rice paddies below the road had cracked open in the drought, and the dust the trucks threw up hung in the air without settling. In front of him, running north to south for about a mile and a half, was a bare brown spine of rock and scrub called Obong Ridge. There were no trees on it. There was no cover on it. There was nothing on those slopes but grass burned the colour of straw and a series of low knobs that the maps identified only by their height in metres. Royce commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines. On paper, a Marine Infantry battalion of that period fielded 3 rifle companies. He had 2. The 4 platoons that would lead the assault up that hill numbered roughly 130 men between them. Dug into the reverse slope above him, in holes cut deep enough that artillery could not reach them, was the 18th Regiment of the North Korean 4th Division, reinforced by a battalion from the 16th. They had been on that ridge for 11 days. They had already broken 4 separate American attempts to take it. Behind Royce, east beyond the town of Yongsan, was Miryang. Behind Miryang was the rail line that carried every round of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, and every replacement rifleman into the Pusan Perimeter. If the North Koreans came off that ridge and took the road to Miryang, the last defended corner of South Korea would be cut in half, and there was no second line behind it to fall back to. The order that had brought the Marines to this valley had been given 2 days earlier by an angry 3-star general who had run out of patience and out of options. It was not complicated. Clear the bulge. Do it now. At the eastern base of the ridge sat a cluster of mud-walled houses called Obong Village. Royce's men would have to cross about 400 yards of open ground to reach it, then climb. Every yard of that ground was visible from the crest. The naval airstrike that was supposed to soften the ridge was 15 minutes late. The artillery preparation had already been fired into a slope where almost nobody was sitting. At 8 o'clock exactly, the Marines stepped off. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is an independent channel. There is no studio behind these videos and no research department. Every one of these documentaries is built from unit war diaries, official histories, and declassified after-action reports, and it takes weeks to put one together. Our reach has been slipping lately, and the single thing that changes, that is you. If you find this kind of work worth doing, subscribe, leave a comment telling me what you want covered next, and share the video with someone who cares about this period. It costs you nothing, and it decides whether this channel keeps going. Now, back to the Naktong. For 13 days in August of 1950, the North Korean 4th Division held ground on the wrong side of a river that was never supposed to be crossed. The Naktong was not a line on a map. It was a real obstacle, 400 yards wide in places, deep enough in the centre to drown a man in full equipment, and it formed the western wall of the last free ground on the Korean peninsula. The American plan for surviving the summer rested on it. And on the night of August 5 to 6, a North Korean division walked through it in the dark, carrying its rifles over its heads, and established itself in a loop of high ground that the Americans came to call the Naktong Bulge. Everything the United States 8th Army sent to remove them failed. 4 full-scale attacks in 10 days. 3 infantry regiments, one of them fresh and at full strength. Artillery, armour, and air. All of it went up those slopes, and all of it came back down. Then, on August the 17th, a different kind of unit arrived, and the bridgehead that had held for almost 2 weeks was gone in less than 60 hours. The unit that broke it had existed for exactly 6 weeks. It had been assembled out of nothing at a base in California, shipped to Asia before it was finished forming, and thrown into combat before its commander had a complete list of who was actually in it. It was not larger than what the army already had in the Bulge. It was smaller. It was not better equipped in the conventional sense. What it had was one capability that no other formation in Korea possessed, and it had brought that capability with it as part of its own organization instead of asking somebody else for it. To understand why that mattered and why it took the United States almost 2 weeks and 1,800 casualties to work it out, we have to go back to the night the river was crossed. Red and yellow flares went up over the Naktong at midnight on August 5, 1950. The section of river they went up over was held by the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry Regiment, United States 24th Infantry Division. That battalion had 3 rifle companies, all of them badly under strength, and it was responsible for a frontage of roughly 15,000 yards. That is a little over 8 miles of riverbank for a unit that in good order would have struggled to hold 2. The companies were not in a line, they were in clusters, on hills, with gaps of a mile or more between them, and the gaps were covered by nothing but the hope that nobody would find them in the dark. 1 minute after midnight, on the morning of August 6, about 800 men of the 3rd Battalion, 16th Regiment of the North Korean 4th Division, began wading into the water at the Ohang ferry site, 3.5 miles due west of the town of Yongsan. Most of them stripped. They carried their clothing, their boots, and their rifles bundled above their heads and walked into water that came up to their shoulders. Others crossed on rafts. They brought no heavy weapons over on that first passage. They did not need to. They came ashore between I Company and L Company in a gap almost 2 miles wide and simply walked inland up a draw toward Yongsan without meeting anyone at all. The first American unit they hit was a 4.2-inch mortar position. It was overrun in the dark. There is a detail in that crossing that explains a great deal about why the 8th Army could not react in time. The North Koreans did not cross at one place. Over the following nights they used multiple ferry sites along the loop, and the American units watching the river were spread so thin that each observation post could report only what was directly in front of it. Division headquarters received a stream of contact reports that appeared to describe separate small infiltrations rather than a single coordinated operation. For most of the first day, the American command believed it was dealing with a patrol-sized problem and committed forces piecemeal against it, which is the most expensive way there is to fight. By first light, the Americans understood that they had a division-sized problem and no clear picture of where it was. What followed over the next 5 days was one of the most methodical river crossing operations of the war, and the 8th Army could not stop any part of it. The North Koreans built what the Soviets had used on the Eastern Front, and what the Americans had not expected to see in Korea. They laid an underwater bridge at the Kaihang Ferry, sometimes recorded as the Paekchin Ferry, constructing it out of sandbags, logs and rocks piled to a level roughly 1 foot beneath the surface of the water. From the air it was almost invisible. Reconnaissance pilots flew over a stretch of empty river and reported empty river. At night, trucks drove across it with their wheels in the water. Heavy mortars came over. Ammunition came over. Something in the order of 12 artillery pieces came over, some on the bridge, some on rafts. By about August 10, the 4th Division had completed its crossing. The ground it took possession of was not chosen carelessly. West of Yongsan, the Naktong makes a broad westward loop, and inside that loop sits a piece of country roughly 4 miles across and 5 miles deep. The Americans called it the Naktong Bulge. Its value was a line of hills standing across the road from the river to Yongsan, about 3 miles inland. North of the road was a hill mass of 165 meters that the Americans named Cloverleaf because of the shape its contour lines made on a map. South of the road was Obong Ridge. Between them ran the only decent road in the area. Together the two features formed a gate, and whoever held the gate controlled movement in the whole bulge. Obong was not a single hill. It was a chain of knobs running north to south, and each one had to be taken separately. From north to south, the significant heights were 102, 109, 117, 143, 147, and 153 meters. At the southern base of Cloverleaf lay the village of Tugok. At the eastern base of Obong lay Obong village. From the crest of either feature, a North Korean observer could see the American main supply route running back through Yongsan toward Miryang. American war correspondents attached to the Marine Brigade later gave Obong a second name because the maps issued to the newsmen showed the ridge without a label. They called it No Name Ridge. The Marines who fought on it had a shorter name for it, and it was not printable. The man who had put the 4th Division across that river was not a political appointment. Major General Lee Kwon was 40 years old in the summer of 1950. He had been born in Manchuria to Korean parents who had fled Japanese rule. He had fought with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army against the Japanese, and he had gone on to attend a Soviet officers' school. Before he was given the 4th Division, he had served as Chief of Staff of the Korean People's Army. His posting to the division came by personal order of Kim Il-sung. He also arrived with the 2 highest decorations his state could award. He had been made a hero of the Republic, and he held the Order of the National Flag, first class. His division carried an honorific of its own. After the capture of the South Korean capital in the last week of June, Kim Il-sung had designated the 4th the Seoul Division. The record behind those honours was real, and any account of this campaign that treats the North Korean 4th as a mob of untrained conscripts is telling a lie that makes the eventual American victory smaller than it was. The 4th Division had destroyed Task Force Smith at Osan on July 5, the first ground engagement between American and North Korean troops in the war. It had then fought the United States 24th Infantry Division at Chonan, at Chochiwon, at the Kum River, and at Taejon, and it had beaten the 24th every single time. It had taken Taejon in the 3rd week of July, and in the withdrawal from that city, the commanding general of the 24th Division, Major General William F. Dean, became separated from his own troops. Dean spent 36 days alone in the hills before Korean civilians turned him in for a reward. He was captured on August 25, 1950. He was the highest-ranking American captured in the war, and he was not released until 1953. In 6 weeks, it had driven a United States Army division the length of the country. Its soldiers were not amateurs either. A significant part of the North Korean officer corps and a good number of its enlisted men had served in the Chinese Civil War. They understood infiltration, night movement, and the use of terrain in a way that occupation troops from Japan simply did not. But by the time the 4th Division reached the Naktong, it was carrying a hidden problem, and that problem is the hinge on which this entire story turns. On paper, the division was authorized 10,381 men. 6 weeks of continuous offensive operations at the end of a supply line that ran the whole length of the peninsula under American air attack had reduced it to something close to 7,000. 8th Army Intelligence put the figure as high as 8,000. The 3 infantry regiments, the 5th, the 16th, and the 18th, were each down to roughly 1,500 men. Its artillery had been cut down to about a dozen guns. The replacements arriving to fill those gaps were not the veterans of 1948. They were South Korean civilians, many of them conscripted at gunpoint in captured territory, and a significant proportion of them arrived without weapons at all. Lee Kuan-mew's plan rested on a single assumption. It was the same assumption that had been correct every day since June 25. He assumed that the Americans, once fixed frontally and struck at night, would give ground. Every previous engagement had confirmed it. He put his division into the Bulge, intending to cut the Yongsan to Miryang Road and split the Pusan Perimeter, and he was operating on the belief that the force in front of him would break before his own did. That assumption was about to be tested against something that had not been in Korea 2 weeks earlier. On July 7, 1950, 12 days after the invasion began, an order was issued at Camp Pendleton in California, activating a formation that did not exist the day before. It was called the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade. The word provisional was accurate. It was scraped together out of whatever the Marine Corps had immediately available on the West Coast, and the Marine Corps in the summer of 1950 had been cut down almost as far as the Army had. The brigade commander was Brigadier General Edward A. Craig, a veteran of Bougainville, Guam, and Iwo Jima. His deputy and the commander of the brigade's air component was Brigadier General Thomas J. Cushman. The ground element was built around the 5th Marine Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond L. Murray. Murray had been decorated for Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, and he was already selected for promotion to colonel. His 3 battalion commanders were Lieutenant Colonel George R. Newton, Lieutenant Colonel Harold S. Roys, and Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Taplett. The air element was Marine Aircraft Group 33, flying out of the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro. It brought 2 fighter squadrons, VMF 214, known as the Black Sheep, and VMF 323, the Death Rattlers. It also brought a night fighter squadron, VMFN 513, and an observation squadron, VMO6, which brought light aircraft and the first helicopters the Marine Corps had ever taken into a combat theatre. The total strength of the brigade was 6,534 officers and men. Of those, roughly 4,700 were in the ground element. The formation was so rushed that its infantry battalions each had 2 rifle companies instead of 3. The regiment was at roughly 68% of its authorized strength when it sailed. Some of its men had been civilians 2 weeks earlier, called back off the reserve rolls from jobs and families, and they met their squad leaders on the ship. Two things about that force deserve more attention than they usually get. The first is who was in it. The Marine Corps in the summer of 1950 numbered 74,279 men worldwide, having been cut down hard after the Second World War and having only narrowly survived a serious attempt in Washington to reduce its role permanently. To fill the brigade to even 68%, the Corps activated reservists. Men who had come home from Okinawa and Peleliu 5 years earlier, who had jobs and mortgages and small children, were recalled, issued equipment, and put on a ship inside a fortnight. Some of them had not fired a rifle since 1945. A number of the officers and senior non-commissioned officers, by contrast, were Pacific veterans of considerable experience, and it was that thin layer of men who had done this before that held the units together in the first week of combat. The second is the observation squadron. VM-06 brought helicopters, 4 of them, Sikorsky machines, alongside 4 light observation aeroplanes. Rotary wing aircraft had flown rescue missions in Burma in 1944, so this was not the first American combat use. What the Marine official history claims is narrower and survives scrutiny. These were the first helicopter pilots in the American Armed Forces to be formed into a unit for overseas combat service. They were small, underpowered machines by any later standard. What they did in Korea in August of 1950 was carry commanders forward to see their own battlefields, run wounded men out of positions that could not be reached by vehicle, and lay communications wire across ground that was under fire. Craig used one almost daily to move between his battalions. It was an experiment that nobody had time to evaluate, and it changed how casualties were evacuated in every war the United States has fought since. But the thing that separated this brigade from anything else being fed into Korea that summer was not its infantry. It was the fact that the aircraft came with it, as part of the same command, answering to the same general. Marine close air support in 1950 was not a resource requested from a distant headquarters and delivered hours later according to somebody else's priorities. It was an organic weapon of the ground unit. Forward air controllers were Marine officers, most of them pilots themselves, who walked with the rifle companies and talked directly to the aircraft overhead. The aircraft were F-4U Corsairs, propeller-driven, slow enough to see what they were shooting at, and able to loiter over a battlefield for extended periods carrying rockets, bombs, and 20mm cannon. Napalm was available in theory. On the day of the Obong knee attack, there was almost none of it, because a shortage of fuel tanks meant the squadrons had only 4 tanks of it between them. The Corsairs flew from 2 escort carriers standing off the Korean coast. VMF 214 operated from the Sicily. VMF 323 operated from the Badoeng Strait. Because the carriers were close inshore, the transit time was short, and because the controllers were on the ground with the infantry, there was no chain of approvals in between. The figure usually quoted for this brigade is an average of about 7 minutes from a ground unit requesting a strike to ordnance landing on the target. That number comes from Marine aviation histories rather than from a single war diary entry, and it is best treated as an order of magnitude. What can be documented precisely is a specific request on this battlefield, which is coming later in this account, and it was answered in 9. For an infantryman lying on an open slope under machine gun fire, the difference between minutes and an hour and a half is not a statistic. It is the difference between a suppressed enemy position and a dead platoon. The brigade reached Pusan on August 2nd, 1950, and moved out on the 3rd. Aboard the transport in Pusan harbour, Craig gathered his officers and told them plainly what he understood their function to be. The Pusan Perimeter, he said, was like a weakened dike, and they would be used to plug holes in it as they opened. They were a brigade. They were a fire brigade. He added that it would be costly fighting against an enemy who outnumbered them. He did not invent the phrase in that cabin. It had already appeared in the orders he received on July 25th, before the brigade had even sailed. What he did was say it out loud to the men it applied to, and the name stayed attached to the unit for the rest of its short life. It described exactly how they were about to be used. The fire brigade did not go to the Naktong first, and that delay is the reason the Bulge held as long as it did. Within days of landing, the brigade was committed to the far south of the perimeter as part of Task Force Keen, an 8th Army counteroffensive intended to push west from Masan toward Chinju. The Marines went into that attack on August 7 and did something that had not happened yet in the Korean War. And they advanced, and they kept advancing. Between August 7 and August 12, the brigade fought its way through Kosong and towards Sachon, broke a North Korean 6th Division column, and covered ground westward while the rest of the perimeter was contracting. The Corsairs caught the North Korean 83rd Motorcycle Regiment in the open near Kosong and destroyed a large part of its transport in an engagement the Marines afterward called the Kosong Turkey Shoot. Accounts of how many vehicles were left burning vary between 100 and 200, and the Marine official history says so rather than picking a number. The advance was working, and then on August 12th, with the objective in reach, the brigade was ordered to disengage. It was not a defeat. It was arithmetic. Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commanding 8th Army, had exactly one mobile reserve on the entire peninsula, and it was the Marine Brigade. He could use it to win in the south, or he could use it to save the centre. And while the Marines were advancing towards Sachon, the North Korean 4th Division had walked across the Naktong behind them. So the fire brigade turned around, disengaged from an enemy it was beating, loaded onto trucks and trains, and went north to a river it had never seen. 5 days of fighting in the south, thrown away in a single order. It would happen to this brigade 3 times in 6 weeks. It never once got to finish a battle. It started before being sent somewhere else. While the Marines were driving on Sachon, the United States 24th Infantry Division was trying to push the 4th Division back into the Naktong on its own, and it was failing in a way that tells you everything about the state of the American Army in the summer of 1950. The 24th was commanded by Major General John H. Church, who had taken over the division after Dean disappeared at Taejon. Church inherited a division that had been fighting without pause since July 5, had lost a divisional commander, had lost most of its equipment, and in some regiments had lost more than half its rifle strength. The counterattack began on the first morning. On August 6, the 1st Battalion of the 34th Infantry attacked west down the Yongsan Road. That battalion had 20 officers and 471 enlisted men, which is roughly half of what a battalion should be. Its C Company was ambushed on the road, lost more than half its strength in a few minutes, and the survivors made a stand inside a grist mill where they stacked their own dead against the walls to make firing positions. B Battery of the 13th Field Artillery Battalion lost 4 howitzers the same day. On August 8th, Church committed the 9th Infantry Regiment, borrowed from the 2nd Infantry Division, which had just arrived from the United States. The 9th was at full strength, and it was fresh. It was also almost entirely inexperienced, and it was being asked to take Cloverleaf Hill and Obong Ridge from veterans dug into reverse slopes. It got onto the high ground more than once. It could not stay there. On August 10, Church put all forces in the Bulge under a single commander, Colonel John G. Hill of the 9th Infantry, and the resulting formation was designated Task Force Hill. It contained the 9th Regimental Combat Team, less 1 battalion, the 19th Infantry, the 34th Infantry, the 1st Battalion of the 21st Infantry, and supporting artillery. On paper, it was a powerful force. In practice, it was a collection of exhausted fragments under a commander who had inherited them the day before. Task Force Hill attacked on August 11th. It attacked again on August 14th. It attacked again on August 15th. Every attack took ground during the day and lost it at night. The reasons were not mysterious, and they compounded each other. The terrain favoured the defender absolutely. Obong and Cloverleaf are bare. An attacker is visible from the moment he leaves cover, and the defender, dug into the far side of the crest, is invisible and out of reach of flat trajectory fire and most artillery. Taking a reverse slope position means going over the top of the hill and fighting at grenade range with no support. The weather was killing men without a shot being fired. It was an unusually dry and brutally hot summer. Daytime temperatures on the Naktong ran past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the southern front, where the Marines had been fighting a week earlier, the official Marine history records readings of 112 and 114. American troops who had spent the previous years on garrison duty in Japan were not conditioned for any of it, and heat exhaustion took men out of the line in numbers comparable to enemy fire. The units were simply too thin. By the middle of August, the combat effectiveness of the 24th Infantry Division as a whole was estimated at about 40%, and its artillery at about the same. The 34th Infantry was down to roughly 1,100 men in early August, with rifle companies that could not fill their own foxhole lines, and the leadership losses were catastrophic at company level. Master Sergeant Warren H. Jordan of E Company, 9th Infantry, had to take command of his own company on 5 separate occasions between August 10 and August 17, because on 5 separate occasions every officer in it had been killed, wounded, or carried off the hill unconscious from the heat. Air support existed, but it did not arrive when it was needed. Requests went from the ground unit up through division to the Joint Operations Centre, out to an Air Force wing and back down again. Weather-grounded planned strikes. On more than one occasion, the attack went in with no air at all because the aircraft that were promised never appeared. On August 15th, after the latest failure, Walton Walker came forward to Church's command post in person. Walker had already issued the order that defined the whole campaign. On July 29th, he had told his commanders that there would be no more retreating, no more withdrawal, and no readjustment of the lines. There would be no Dunkirk and no Bataan. A retreat to Pusan, he said, would be one of the greatest butcheries in history, and the 8th Army would fight until the end. Standing in Church's command post, Walker gave a shorter order. He told Church he was giving him the Marine Brigade, that he wanted the situation cleaned up, and that he wanted it cleaned up quickly. The Marines were attached to the 24th Infantry Division that same day. The attack was set for the morning of August 17. The plan Church issued was not a Marine plan, and this was not a Marine battle. That distinction matters, and any version of this story that leaves the Army out of it is not history. The attack was a coordinated divisional operation. On the right, north of the road, the 9th Infantry would take Cloverleaf Hill. On the left, south of the road, the Marines would take Obong Ridge. The road itself was the boundary between them. Neither could succeed if the other failed, because whoever held one feature could shoot into the flank of anyone attacking the other. The Army had 10 days of blood invested in that ground already, and the 9th Infantry's attack on Cloverleaf on the 17th was as hard fought as anything the Marines did. What the Marines added was not numbers. They were joining a force that already outnumbered them. What they added was a fresh regiment that had not been fighting since July, and an air group that answered to their own general. The tactical problem was brutal, and everyone understood it before it began. Obong had to be taken from the front. There was no flank. To the south, the ridge ran into broken country that could not be crossed quickly. To the north was the road, and then Cloverleaf, which was itself an objective. The only approach was to cross about 400 yards of open paddy and bare lower slope in daylight, under observed fire, and then climb. Murray's regiment would attack with 1 battalion forward. Royce's 2nd Battalion drew the assault. Newton's 1st Battalion would be in reserve, ready to pass through. Taplett's 3rd Battalion was in regimental reserve. Royce's 2 rifle companies, D and E, would take separate objectives. E Company would go against the northern knobs, including Hill 109, with a platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Nicholas D. Arcadice, striking the village of Obong at the foot of hills 143 and 147. D Company would take the ground to the south. Supporting the attack were the guns of the 1st Battalion, 11th Marines, an Army Artillery Battalion firing in support, the brigade's tank company with its M26 Pershings, and 18 Corsairs from Marine Aircraft Group 33. It is worth being precise about how the air control system actually functioned, because it is the mechanism the whole battle turns on, and it is usually described in vague terms. A Marine Tactical Air Control Party was a small team attached down at battalion level. It was built around an officer who was himself a pilot, on a rotation out of a squadron, which meant the man calling the strike understood exactly what the aircraft above him could and could not do, how long it could stay, and what its ordnance would do to a hillside. He was on the ground with the rifle companies, and he could see the target with his own eyes. He talked directly to the flight leader. There was no intermediate headquarters weighing his request against somebody else's. The aircraft themselves were suited to the job in a way that faster machines were not. The F-4U Corsair was a propeller-driven fighter designed in the late 1930s, and by 1950 it was obsolete as an air superiority aircraft. Over a ground battle that did not matter. It could fly slowly enough for the pilot to identify a machine gun position, it could orbit for a long time, and it could carry a heavy and varied load. Against troops dug into a reverse slope, an aircraft that can come in low along the axis of the ridge and drop ordnance on the far side of the crest is doing something artillery physically cannot do. North of the road the same morning, the 9th Infantry went up Cloverleaf without any of that. Its soldiers made the attack under Air Force-controlled support arrangements that had already failed them 4 times that fortnight, and they took the hill anyway, at a cost that does not appear in most retellings of this battle because the retellings are usually about the Marines. The preparation was scheduled to run right up to the moment the infantry crossed the line of departure. That timing is the whole point of a preparation on a reverse slope position. The defenders sit out the bombardment on the protected side of the crest and then run back over the top to their fighting positions once the shelling lifts. The only way to beat that is to keep them down until the attacking infantry is already on the slope. At 8 o'clock in the morning on August 17th, the artillery fired and the infantry crossed the paddies. The Corsairs were 15 minutes late. They had half the time on target they were supposed to have. Watching the strikes go in from his observation post, Church remarked that the ridge looked as though it were floating, and it did under the smoke and dust. But a reverse slope does not care how impressive the smoke looks from the front. When the Marines came out of the paddy and started up the forward face of Obong Ni, the 18th Regiment came back over the crest and took its positions, and it was still there. The first machine guns opened at close range from the high ground and from Tugok on the far side of the road, where the 9th Infantry had not yet cleared the enemy off Cloverleaf. What happened over the next 4 hours was the worst morning the Marine Corps had had since the Pacific. The assault companies went up a slope with no cover, into interlocking fire from front and flank, and they kept going. 2nd Lieutenant Arkadis got his platoon into Obong village at the foot of the ridge and led it through the houses in close fighting. He was later awarded the Silver Star for it. At 11 o'clock in the morning, immediately behind a Corsair strike, a platoon of D Company under 2nd Lieutenant Michael Schinker reached the crest near the northern end of the ridge and took it. There were 15 Marines still on their feet when they got there. 15 men cannot hold a hill against a battalion. The counterattack came almost at once, and they were forced back down the way they had come. Of the roughly 240 men of the 2nd Battalion who led that attack, 142 had become casualties by midday. That is a casualty rate that ends most units as fighting formations. Roy's battalion was finished as an attacking force before lunch. Murray, watching the assault come apart, made the decision to commit his reserve immediately rather than wait, and passed Newton's 1st Battalion through to continue the attack. It kept pressure on the ridge, but it also meant the fresh battalion went in piecemeal, and it gave the defenders a pause between blows. The cost went on rising. Captain John Tobin, commanding B Company of the 1st Battalion, was badly wounded and evacuated. Command passed to Captain Francis Fenton, known throughout the regiment as Ike. B Company had entered the battle with 5 officers and about 190 men. By daylight on August 18th, it had 110 men still standing, and Fenton was the only officer left in it. Marine and Army sources differ slightly on the exact figure, and the official Army history says openly that the Marine casualty returns for those 2 days do not fully agree with each other. A photographer from an American magazine, David Douglas Duncan, photographed Fenton during that period, sitting on the ground, filthy, exhausted, briefing what was left of his company. It became one of the defining photographs of the Korean War, and most people who have seen it have no idea what battle it was taken at. By late afternoon on August 17th, the Marines held part of the ridge and had been thrown off the rest of it. The 9th Infantry had fought its way onto Cloverleaf. Both sides were exhausted, and Lee Kwon-moo, who had watched 2 American regiments break themselves on his position in a single day, decided that this was the moment to finish it. At about 8 o'clock that evening, the 4th Division counterattacked with armour. A column of T-34 tanks came down the road from the west toward the gap between Cloverleaf and Obong Ni, with infantry moving with them. The T-34-85 was the tank that had beaten everything the United States had put in front of it for 6 weeks. In the first month of the war, American troops had watched bazooka rockets bounce off its glacis plate at point-blank range. The Americans in the defile were ready for it this time, and what happened in the next few minutes was the single most concentrated anti-armour engagement of the Pusan Perimeter. Army infantry on hill, 125 engaged the column with rockets. Marines' 75mm recoilless rifles fired from positions covering the road. Neither stopped the lead tank. Then the Marine armour came forward. The 3rd Platoon of the Brigade's Tank Company, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Granville G. Sweet, moved M26 Pershings into the road. The Pershing carried a 90mm gun and it was the first American tank in Korea that could kill a T-34 cleanly at combat range. The lead Pershing, Tank A-34, was commanded by Technical Sergeant Cecil Fullerton. It met the leading T-34 at a range of roughly 100 yards. At that distance, the gunner needed no ballistic correction whatsoever. 3 rounds went into the North Korean tank, and it stopped where it stood. The second Pershing, a 33 under Sergeant Gerald Swinnaker, came up alongside, and together the 2 tanks engaged the second and third T-34s in the column. Both were destroyed. Rocket teams and recoilless rifles worked the wreckage. The 4th tank in the column did not survive the night either, though the sources disagree about who killed it. The Army official history credits air attack. Marine accounts credit a rocket team on the ground. Both versions were written from the reports of men who were there in the dark, and neither has ever been reconciled. 4 T-34s entered that defile. None of them left it. It was the first time Marine armour had engaged the T-34, and the result went through both armies within days. The tank that could not be killed had been killed 4 times in a few minutes, in front of the infantry of 2 divisions. The night that followed was, in Craig's own description, nip and tuck. The 4th Division counterattacked the ridge repeatedly through the hours of darkness. At 2:30 in the morning on August 18th, a green flare went up from Hill 117, and the attack came in against A Company, isolating one of its platoons. In the neighbouring sector, it took 3/4 of an hour of close fighting to throw the attackers off. The Marines gave ground on the crest and held the shoulders. But those night attacks were the last strength the 18th Regiment had, and it spent all of it in the dark. At dawn on August 18th, the Corsairs of VM F-323 were over the ridge before the infantry moved. At 34 minutes past 7 in the morning, Newton called for a strike on a machine gun position that was holding up his advance. 9 minutes later, a Death Rattler pilot put a 500-pound bomb onto it. The bomb landed so close to the Marine line that the blast knocked an entire advancing platoon off its feet and killed 1 Marine outright. 5 minutes after that, the survivors of that platoon walked onto Hill 117 and took it. That sequence, request at 34 minutes past 7, ordnance at 43 minutes past 7, objective taken at 48 minutes past 7, is the whole argument for organic close air support compressed into 14 minutes, and it was repeated up and down the ridge all morning. Knob by knob, the Marines and Task Force Hill took Obong apart. Taplett's 3rd Battalion, which had been held in regimental reserve through the slaughter of the previous day, came forward and worked south along the spine, clearing the remaining knobs one at a time in the pattern the ridge demanded. Take a knob, reorganise on it, bring the air onto the next one, move. It was slow and it was methodical, and it was the exact opposite of what had been tried on the 17th. And it worked because the defenders had spent themselves in the night attacks and could no longer counterattack faster than the Marines could consolidate. Hill 207, west of the ridge, fell the same day. And then the thing every attacking commander waits for happened. The defence did not give ground. It broke. Forward observers and pilots began reporting men moving west in the open, away from the hills, toward the river. The 4th Division was not withdrawing in order. It was running. What followed at the crossing sites was not a battle. American artillery fired delayed fuse rounds into the water among men who were swimming. Corsairs worked the length of the fords and the riverbank with cannon and rockets. There was no cover on the river, and there was no way to move quickly through it. Early on August 19th, Marines coming down off the ridge met soldiers of the 34th Infantry on the riverbank. By that evening, there was no organised North Korean force east of the Naktong. The bulge that had held for 13 days had been cleared in less than 60 hours. The immediate consequences ran far beyond one loop in a river. The 4th Division, the Seoul Division, the formation that had destroyed Task Force Smith and captured an American divisional commander, ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. By August 19, the entire division numbered about 3,500 men. Its 3 infantry regiments were reduced to somewhere between 300 and 400 effectives each. It abandoned 34 artillery pieces on the east bank, the largest of them a 122mm howitzer, along with hundreds of automatic weapons and thousands of rifles. American burial parties counted more than 1,200 North Korean dead on the ground. The division was never rebuilt to its former standard, and it was never again the spearhead of a North Korean offensive. There is a detail in the timing of this that is almost too neat to be true, and it is in the official record. On August 19th, the day his division finished dying on the far bank, Lee Kwon-moo received an order from Kim Il-sung, drafted days earlier, conferring guard status on the 4th Division in recognition of its earlier victories. The honor arrived while the survivors were still coming out of the water. The effect on the American side was harder to measure and more important. The reverse slope tactic had been beaten, and beaten in a way that could be taught. The method was not complicated. Keep the enemy off the crest until the assault infantry is already climbing, and the only weapon that can do that reliably is an aircraft controlled by someone who can see the attacking platoon. Within weeks, that lesson was moving through 8th Army. The myth of the T-34 went with it. Between the 4 tanks killed in the defile on the 17th and further armour destroyed in the days after, the Pershing and the 3.5-inch rocket launcher had converted the T-34 from an unanswerable problem into a target. Infantry that had been going around North Korean tanks began going through them. The strategic effect showed up on a timetable. Kim Il-sung had set August 15th, the 5th anniversary of liberation from Japanese rule, as the date by which the peninsula was to be taken. The Naktong Bulge was one of 4 simultaneous North Korean thrusts into the perimeter that month, and it was the one aimed at the shortest route to cutting the 8th Army in half. When it collapsed on August 19, the anniversary was already gone, and the best division in the North Korean order of battle had been written off with it. Every additional week the perimeter held meant more American divisions arriving through Pusan, and it meant time for a plan that was already being drawn up in Tokyo for a landing far up the west coast. And Walker had learned something about how to use his one reserve. The brigade went straight back into 8th Army's pocket. It was pulled out of the bulge and moved again almost immediately. The paper record behind all of this is unusually complete, and it is worth saying where the numbers in this video come from. The authoritative American account is Roy E. Appleman's Official Army History, South to the Naktong, North to the Yalu, published in 1961. It was built directly from unit war diaries, from Allied translator and interpreter section prisoner of war interrogation reports, and from captured North Korean documents. The Marine side is covered by the official history written by Lynn Montross and Captain Nicholas Canzona, and by the Marine Corps commemorative monograph Fire Brigade, written by Captain John Chapin. T. R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War supplies much of what is known in English about Lee Kwon-moo personally. The interrogation material is where the picture of the 4th Division's internal collapse comes from. Captured officers, among them the division's artillery operations officer, described desertion running at around 40% among the newly conscripted replacements, roughly half of those replacements arriving with no weapon at all and effectively no system for treating or evacuating wounded men. A formation can absorb heavy casualties. It cannot absorb heavy casualties while also feeding in unarmed conscripts who are leaving as fast as they arrive. The air statistics are worth stating carefully because inflated versions circulate. What is firmly established from marine and naval sources is that the 2 Corsair squadrons flew on the order of 1,350 sorties over the whole Pusan Perimeter period, and that marine tactical air control parties directed roughly 80% of the strikes flown in support of marine units. Higher and more specific figures for individual days appear in secondary accounts, and they are not consistently corroborated. Craig's own assessment is the more useful measure. He said afterward that the close air support furnished by Marine airmen was a marvel to everybody concerned, including the Marines, and that they had never seen anything like it, even in practice. The North Korean view is recorded in the interrogation reports as well. Asked which American weapon he feared most, one prisoner did not name artillery or tanks. He said the blue airplanes. The cost figures should be stated plainly, because they are the part most often left out. The Marine Brigade's losses in this specific action came to 66 killed, 278 wounded, and 1 man missing. Across the whole battle, American casualties ran to roughly 1,800, of which about a third were killed. The 19th Infantry lost around 450. The 34th Infantry lost around 400. The 9th Infantry lost 180. The 27th and 21st Infantry regiments lost roughly 150 and 100 respectively. The great majority of those losses were suffered by the United States Army in the fighting that preceded the brigade's arrival. One more correction belongs here because it circulates constantly and it is wrong. No Medal of Honor was awarded for the First Battle of the Naktong Bulge. The Navy Crosses eventually earned by Murray, Royce and Taplett were awarded for Incheon and for the Chosin Reservoir later that year, not for this fight. What was awarded at Obong Ni was the Army Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star, given to Marines under Army Command. Second Lieutenant Thomas Henry Johnston of a company received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously for August 17th. Staff Sergeant T. Albert Crowson, acting as a platoon leader, received it for silencing 2 machine gun emplacements the same day. Corporal Jewel Clyde Bruce of B Company received it posthumously for August 18. The men who fought this battle did not stay long enough to be associated with it. The brigade was pulled out of the Bulge within days and returned to 8th Army Reserve. On the 1st of September, the North Koreans came back into the same ground, this time with the 2nd and 9th Divisions, in what became the Second Battle of the Naktong Bulge. It was the most dangerous penetration of the entire Pusan Perimeter campaign. Yongsan itself was briefly lost. Walker reached for the fire brigade again, and on September 3, the Marines counterattacked west of Yongsan, fighting over ground they had already taken once, and again destroyed North Korean armour near Tugok. Then they were pulled out again. Across all of its Pusan perimeter operations, the brigade suffered around 900 total casualties. On September 13, 1950, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was formally deactivated, and its units were absorbed into the 1st Marine Division. 2 days later, they went ashore at Incheon. That is why almost nobody has heard of this battle. It was swallowed whole. Incheon was a landing behind enemy lines, planned by MacArthur over the objections of his own staff, and it produced the photographs and the newsreels and the headlines. Obongni Ridge produced a casualty list. The individual fates are a mixed record. Edward Craig went on to serve as Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Marine Division at Incheon and at the Chosin Reservoir. He retired as a Lieutenant General in 1951 after 33 years in uniform and died at his home in California in December of 1994 at the age of 98. Raymond Murray received a Silver Star for the Pusan Perimeter fighting, the 4th of his career. He led the 5th Marines at Incheon and in the withdrawal from Chosin, where he was awarded a 2nd Navy Cross, his first having been earned at Saipan in 1944. He retired a Major General and died on November 11, 2004. Harold Royce, whose battalion was destroyed as an attacking force in 4 hours on August 17th, went on to earn 2 Navy Crosses in the campaigns that followed. Robert Taplett earned a Navy Cross at Chosin and a Silver Star at Incheon. Ike Fenton stayed in the Marine Corps, served later in Vietnam, and retired a colonel in 1970. He died in 1998 and is buried at Arlington. The photograph of him remains far better known than his name. Lee Kwon Moo was promoted to Lieutenant General. He was given command of a North Korean corps during the Chinese offensives of 1951, and after the armistice, he returned to duty as Chief of Staff of the Korean People's Army. He did not survive the politics. In the purges Kim Il-sung ran against the officers associated with the Chinese and Soviet factions, Lee lost his position around the middle of 1959 and disappeared from public life. The circumstances and even the date of his death are poorly documented outside North Korea. There is a line that circulates about this battle in which army infantrymen are said to have called out, asking for the Marines. It is repeated constantly, and it cannot be sourced to anything. What the official Marine history actually records is duller and more convincing. It says that the effectiveness of the close air support astonished the army troops fighting alongside them. Astonishment is a fair word for watching a bomb land on a machine gun 9 minutes after somebody asked for it. The North Korean state has never let the 4th Division go. North Korean sources describe the wartime 4th as having been reconstituted and honoured, and the formation is presented today as the Guards Seoul Kim Chaek 4th Infantry Division, renamed for Kim Chaek, one of Kim Il-sung's closest wartime associates. It appears in state commemorations, and it was described during the events marking the 70th anniversary of the armistice in 2023 as a world-famous brave combat unit. Whether a distinct division of that lineage actually exists in the current Korean People's Army order of battle is not confirmed by any Western assessment. 75 years of reorganization toward corps and brigade structures have made the claim impossible to verify from outside. What is certain is that the state considers the name worth keeping, which tells you what the summer of 1950 still means in Pyongyang. On the southern side, the river became a memorial rather than a defense line. The Naktong River Victory Memorial Hall opened on June 25, 1979 in Apsan Park in the city of Daegu, some distance northeast of the Bulge itself. Since 2009, the Republic of Korea has held an annual commemoration at Kwon, further north along the same river, marking the defense of the perimeter. The Bulge itself is farmland again. The confrontation moved permanently north to the demilitarized zone, and the Naktong has not been a military obstacle since 1950. The American formation has had a stranger afterlife. United States Marine Corps Forces Korea exists today as a standing command, running combined training with the Republic of Korea Marine Corps, and the Corps maintains forward and rotational forces across the Indo-Pacific. But the model that made the Fire Brigade work in 1950, a self-contained air-ground team held in reserve and thrown at whichever crisis opened first, is currently being rebuilt around a very different problem. Under the reorganization known as Force Design, the Marine Corps has been converting to units built for fighting inside contested island chains, rather than for plugging holes in a continental land front. The centerpiece is the Marine Littoral Regiment, a formation designed to disperse across islands and attack ships. The 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment stands in Hawaii and the 12th in Okinawa, equipped with systems including the ground-launched anti-ship missile called Nemesis and the air defense system known as MADIS. That transition has not been smooth or uncontested. In October of 2025, the Commandant, General Eric Smith, announced that the Corps would establish 2 Marine Littoral Regiments rather than the planned 3 and cancelled a program for a ground-based Tomahawk battery. 3 former commandants publicly criticised the decisions. The argument between them is, at bottom, the same argument the Naktong answered in 1950. What do you build a rapid reaction force for, and how much do you give up in general purpose capability to specialise it? Large-scale exercises continue across the region under a concept the Corps describes as 2 Marine Expeditionary Forces abreast, including the Resolute Dragon series with Japan and the Kamandag exercises with the Philippines. The equipment has almost nothing in common with a Corsair and a Pershing tank. The organising idea, an air-ground team that answers to one commander and can be somewhere it was not expected within days, is the same idea Edward Craig described in a briefing tent at Pusan. What the Naktong actually proved was narrower than the myth, and more useful than the myth, and it has almost nothing to do with which service wore which uniform. A dug-in enemy on the far side of a crest cannot be reached by anything that shoots in a straight line. He can only be reached by something that comes over the top of the hill and puts explosive on the reverse slope in the seconds, while the attacking infantry is still climbing. That is a coordination problem before it is a firepower problem, and the side that solves it takes the ridge. In August of 1950, the only formation in Korea that had solved it was the one that owned its own aircraft. Everything else follows from that. The tanks in the defile, the knobs falling one after another on the 18th, the men in the water on the 19th. Harold Royce sent his leading platoons up that ridge at 8 o'clock in the morning on August 17, 1950, 130 men behind an airstrike that arrived 15 minutes late. 2 days later, the river behind Obong Ni was full of men trying to swim west, and the Seoul Division was finished,